Hi, welcome to Eclectic Images and Crafting with Kathy. This video is the third in our series of Embossing Adventures, where we're exploring different coloured embossing powders and some of the things that you can do with them. So today we're going to be using a couple of different ones, mostly Mink and Royal Satin. We're going to be creating this lovely card here, which has got a antiqued background, and then we're using one of our Mandala stamps and embossing it in the two different colours, which creates a lovely patina effect, but you've got really nice shine from both those colours. So I've matched a darker colour with a lighter colour and picked ones that have both got a similar amount of sheen to them. So the products that we're using today in the Eclectic Images stamps, we've got Mandala Floral, Fleur, Splatter, and then I'm also using one of the greetings out of the Stylized sentiment set. As I said, we're using embossing powders in the colours of Satin Velvet and mostly Mink. I'll just tip those up so you can see the colours better. Really deep blue and hard to describe, a silvery pinky brown. Very hard to describe, mostly Mink, but looks great when you use it. Our ink colours we're working with today is Catherine Pooler's Sandcastle, Over Coffee, Icing on the Cake, and we will also be using some Versamark for our embossing. So we're going to start by creating our background first. And I've done this beginning with the Sandcastle ink pad, and I'm going to use it direct to paper, but quite gently. I want just a very soft look. So I'm just going to start at the top of the page and just wipe the ink pad down my page. So we're just getting like a streaky texture in the background. Turn the card around and I can wipe from the other end. So I'm quite liking if we get some streaks. And if you're not getting enough streaky, you can tip the ink pad on its side slightly and just add a few with the edge of the ink pad. Okay, so we get a nice antique-y looking background right from the start. Then I'm going to switch to, now in the sample that I did, I'm just going to bring that forward a bit. In the sample, I actually used Sandcastle for stamping the Fleur image. But on this one, I'm going to go to the Over Coffee, which is a deeper colour. This is the middle brown. And what we're going to do is we're going to have our Splatter stamp standing by on an acrylic block. We're going to ink up our Fleur stamp. And remember, with Catherine Pooler ink pads, they're very juicy and they're very soft, so it's just a tap on the ink pad. Don't smoosh it into it. We're then going to lay this on the Splatter stamp, and I'm just working out where my mandala is going to go, so I can work out which area, how much I want to distress the Fleur stamp. So what I'm going to be doing here is using the Splatter stamp to actually distress the Fleur image. So I lay it on the splatter, give it a little bit of a twist, and that's actually lifting some of the ink off the stamp. We then stamp it onto our card. I can then ink up again, onto the Splatter stamp, bit of a twist, stamp it down. Ink again. And you see I'm working up a background. Ink again. Okay, now I'm just going to stop and give the Splatter stamp a bit of a clean. Just so we've still got clean stamp to be making sure that we're wiping that ink off. Bit of a twist. Okay, now I'm going to start heading down this side, and these ones I want them to actually, as we're heading towards where I'm going to emboss the mandala, I want the pattern to get lighter. So what I'm going to do is actually move from the very spotty part of the Splatter stamp down to this more dense part. So it will actually take more of the ink off, and we'll get a more antiqued version. So let's ink up, take some ink off, ink up, lift some ink off. Okay, so that just gives you a lovely antique look to the solid stamp. The other thing that you can do with the splatter stamp is we can actually add some splatter with it. And to do this, I'm going to switch to the, actually no, we'll stick with the over coffee to start with. As I grab a slight drink. Okay, so the more dense area, this is a great, the splatter stamp's a great way to build up a bit of background colour. The more dense area will actually create more coverage of colour. So I'm going to ink up with my over coffee, have a bit of a cough, and a drink of water. Okay, and I'm going to stamp it on my scrap once, and then I'm going to repeatedly stamp it. And it's going to build up this little bit of background colour. I'll do a bit down this corner as well. It can actually work really well, particularly with when you've got shades of similar colours, either in the Catherine Paula inks or, again, the Versamark chalk inks work really well for this background sort of effect. To actually layer it with a couple of colours, so we can actually do it with the Sandcastle first, then the over coffee, and then finish up with the icing on the cake, and you get quite a graduation of colours. So with the icing on the cake, I'm going to now turn the stamp around and use the more open splatter part and add some more dots in there. So it's quite a versatile background stamp, this one. Okay. So that's built up our background layers. Now, because I'm going to be doing embossing, I'm actually going to switch to a background that I prepared earlier so that I know that it's really dry before we start doing our embossing over the top. So just going to grab this one that I've already prepared and grab our Mandala floral stamp. Let's move all our browns out of here now because we're going to be picking up on our embossing colours. So I'll spread out my bits of paper, moving everything around the place on the desk, probably totally confusing my poor cameraman. Laying out some bits of paper ready to catch embossing powders. Just make sure that they're clean from the last video that we did. And as I said, working with the Satin Velvet, which is a deep blue, as well as the Mostly Mink, which is the silvery green. So I'm just laying those out ready. Silvery green, silvery brown. Okay, let's ink up our stamp thoroughly with Versamark. I want it to be really well covered. Now, because I've been doing background effects, I mean, we should always use our anesthetic pad anyway, but just to make sure that's all really dry and our embossing's only going to stick where we want it, I'll just wipe over it with the embossing buddy. So the embossing buddy is an anti-static pad. So that actually helps to stop this, the embossing powder when we pop it on the card, helps to stop it sticking to the rest of the card. Okay, let's make sure that's really well inked. Pop it in and put quite a bit of pressure on. I want to get all those details of the stamp. I'm really, particularly in the middle, really giving it a good push. Because something of this technique is something you cannot go back over and re-ink it like you can with some other stamping techniques. Okay, let's get, now I want quite a bit of the blue on there. Don't just dump it on though, because you do want to allow a little bit of area where the other embossing powder is going to stick. Okay, now I'm just going to very quickly tip it over, give it a tap, good tap on the back to get off any excess of the blue. Then we switch over to our Mostly Mink, and now I can just tip it over the whole thing. Tap it down, over, and give it a good tap on the back. And hopefully we've now got it mostly blue, but with just a little bit of the mink in there as well. I'm just going to pop my embossing powders back in their jars. And with the mink, I know I've finished with that now, so I can actually pop the lid back on the jar and put it to one side. Now we get our heat gun out. And watch the magic begin. I'm just going to make sure that satin velvet colour is well out of the way before I start heating. So hopefully we're going to get lots of blue with just some highlights of that mink coming through. You see the colour changing? I said both these colours have got quite a bit of mica in them, which is what gives them that beautiful shine. Excellent. So it's a really nice contrast between the shine of the embossing powders and the very earthy, antiqued background. Just want to add a couple more bits to this. I'm going to use a sentiment Thinking of You, which is from our Stylized sentiment set. Just going to have a think about where I'm going to pop that. So let's just look around where it's going to fit. Maybe over that way because of our mandala being that side. Pop it this way. Yep. Okay, so let's ink up with our Versamark. Now, if you're ever unsure of being able to line up a text stamp straight, one trick is to deliberately put it on an angle so it looks like you always meant it to be that way. Another one is to use something like a stamping platform or a MISTI so that you can actually pre-line up your stamp into the platform, and that's going to give you the image exactly where you want it. Another one is when you're putting your stamp onto your block, line the edge of the block up on some lined paper so that you can actually see that where the edge of the block is, that your text is lined up on another line. And that's so you'd have it laid down that way. Look at the lines on the paper and line your stamp up with those lines. But of course I'm just going to wing it here. That's what we do, isn't it? So tip it up, and I'm doing it upside down. Let's see how we go. Okay, pressure across, don't rock it side to side, just make sure you put good pressure over the whole stamp. Lift up and let's pop our embossing powder on. Just going to check with this one that I have got all the powder off where I don't want it, and I have. So we'll give that a heat. Just missed a little bit on the U there. There we go. So that's all nice and shiny. The other bit I want to add to, no, I just didn't get a little bit on the ends of some of those letters. Okay, with this one I'm actually going to emboss a border around the edge of it. So to do this, we've already got a little bit of our satin velvet on our scrap bit of paper there. So to do this, I'm actually just going to wipe the Versamark. Instead of where I normally, you can see I've already done a bit of a brown edge around it. But I'm actually going to wipe the Versamark ink pad around the edge and then dip that into our embossing powder. And we'll stop and give that a bit of a heat before we move on to the next edge. If I wanted it to be very neat, I could actually put a piece of double-sided tape along there and use that for the embossing powder to stick to, but I'm actually happy to have it a little bit ragged. So swipe that along my ink pad, dip it into my embossing powder, and we'll do a heat. I'll just move that around so that I'm actually still facing that heat gun away from where my loose embossing powder is. Swipe, dip, and heat. We'll have a look when we finish this and see whether, now that we've added the extra embossing in there, whether our mandala is still standing out enough or whether it's become too much of a background, because we could use some of our inks to actually shade that a bit and make those colours stand out a little bit more. If we think it needs it, we'll have a look in a moment. So into our embossing, make sure we've got everywhere. I think that's rather nice actually, but I think we have lost the mandala a little bit, so I'm just going to grab some of the darker brown ink, the icing on the cake. Actually, I'm just going to go with Over Coffee, which is the one that we stamped the mandala, the Fleur de Lis with, and I'll get my water brush, which I've put down somewhere else because I didn't think I'd be using it in this session. Just give it a little bit of a run on my hand, make sure it's a bit damp. Now with something like this, I can put a bit of this ink onto an acrylic block or onto my craft mat to make a palette, but because there's a little bit in the lid here, I can actually just use it directly from there. So I'm just going to pick up some brown and just shade in around the edge of the mandala there. I think that's just going to help it stand out a little bit more. So I'm not trying to do any fancy colouring here, just adding a little bit of shadow. So I'm just laying the colour down and then just encouraging it to flow into the design in a couple of spots. Because we've done such an antique looking background, I don't want this colouring to look like I've gone to the exact same amount each time. I just want it to be a little bit ragged as well. And you'll notice again that I turn the card around so that I can point the edge of the brush right up to that edge that I want to get to without going over the edge. So that's just given us a little bit more, a bit more depth there to help those bright colours stand out a little bit more, the bright colours of the embossing. So that's one with no extra colouring on it, although it's got a little bit of inking on that one. I did add a little bit of darker ink to it. And on this one, I actually also added some of the Sunflower Sparkle metallic background spray. But I'm like, with having added in the extra blue around the edges on that one, I think the background being quite matte works better. It's one of those things, I mean, if I felt like doing a bit of shine there, it would be fine, but I'm actually quite enjoying, quite liking the quite matte look to that one. And I think I rather like this one here where it's quite light in the centre with just a shading around the edge. I feel that's bringing out the pattern here where I felt that I lost it a little bit with the darker shading on that one. Just some of those things that you experiment with just to see what you like in the look of. There's nothing wrong with either of those cards, but it just gives you a little bit of a different look. And sometimes by experimenting, you'll then refine your techniques a bit and go, well, yeah, that was good, but I like this one better. And that, once it was mounted up on a darker coloured cardstock, would come up fantastic. So thank you for being with me. That's just added some extra techniques that you can do with your embossing. So doing the multicolour embossing and adding the edging around there as well. Just going to pop that forward there onto the black background so Matthew can get a nice shot of it. One last close up before we head off. There we go. That blue is such a great colour, and I just think blue and browns work so well together. So thank you very much for joining us on our journey through exploring some different colours of embossing powders, how you can use them together. Again, we'll put a list on when we post this clip up, we'll put a list of all the stamps and colours that we've used. There'll also be a link there to our Facebook page where we have lots of pictures of ideas and things of different colour combinations. There'll be a link there to our website and also the subscribe button. So again, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you again soon.